Welcome, beautiful community, to this video about Mr. Dugin's love letter to Mr. Prigozhin. I'm hoping that these have been special, or at least okay, days for you around the Easter period, whatever this period of the year means for you. Sending you lots of love and welcoming you to this certainly surreal but also somewhat dark conversation that'll teach us a bit about intra-elite conflict in Russia. It also teaches us about how bizarre the information environment gets in societies that are at the limit. And we're going to read sections of Mr. Dugin's extraordinarily deranged love letter. But as we go along, we're going to make a few observations and then we'll sum it up at the end perhaps. And I think that there's probably four things that we'll focus on. The first is that Mr. Dugin is in a remarkable way invariably trying to run ahead of the steam train, trying to guess where the Kremlin and the information environment in Russia is going, and he's trying to get there before it gets there. So he's not framing a narrative, he's anticipating the drift of it. That's the first point we'll focus on. And the second point we'll focus on is the functionality of Mr. Dugin as somebody who tests the water for the Kremlin, a position that is very dangerous for him because that activity can overnight cease to be useful the way Dugin is doing it, and then Dugin could be irrelevant or gone. The third thing we'll look at is that this is absolutely Mr. Dugin taking sides with Mr. Prigozhin over Mr. Girkin, and we'll look at the differences between the two a bit more. And fourthly, this is Mr. Dugin engaging in what we call consumerist entrepreneurial grift. That is to say, relating to the informational environment in the way a consumer relates to shopping, that is to say, entrepreneurially riding the waves of public sentiment and algorithm and so on available to one, and then seeing what benefit accrues from that. I'm not saying that's all Mr. Dugin is doing. That's a big part of what he's doing, and that, of course, is a tragedy for Mr. Dugin if it's true, which it is. So let's look at this extraordinary love letter. For Russians, Mr. Dugin says, Mr. Prigozhin has become the main symbol of victory, decisiveness, heroism, courage, and steadfastness. For the enemy, a source of hatred, but at the same time also fear and horror. Prigozhin not only leads the most combat-ready, victorious, and invincible unit of the Russian armed forces, but at the same time gives vent to those feelings, thoughts, demands, and hopes that live in the hearts of people of war, completely, irreversibly immersed in its element. Now, we're not just going to look at the elite conflict and at the Russian information environment. We're also going to be looking at what is a kind of a faux attempt at fascization, a faux attempt at, via just words on Telegram and other platforms, instigating a totalitarian turn, a radical totalitarian turn that goes beyond anything that's been done in Russia so far. Wagner is not a private military company, Mr. Prigozhin says. Money has nothing to do with it. This is a military brotherhood. It's people who have responded to the call of the motherland at the most difficult time. Now, what about all the other warriors? The real army, Mr. Kadyrov's folks, and here Dugin offers a different list. Well, he says they're a bit different to the Wagner folks. And the point is that the Wagner folks aren't just ahead of the rest in terms of what they do on the field of battle, village by village, city by city, freeing their native land from cruel and the vile maniacal enemy. They also give style to this war, become its symbols, and they establish the most accurate and sincere discourse about what this war really is. It's the rarest case when military exploits, incredible in their significance and scale, are accompanied by equally poignant ideological declarations. Let me just be absolutely clear. We are thoroughly rejecting the deranged diatribe that we're exploring here. So we're quoting Mr. Dugin, but we're rejecting what he's saying, and we're also not going to use the N-word that Mr. Dugin uses, because sometimes on YouTube it's not a good idea to overdo this. But if this is so, he goes on to say, then these ideological declarations are not only directed against the enemy, Ukrainian N-word, and the globalist liberal West supporting it, but also against the injustice that is sometimes happening inside Russia itself. Wagner's war is about national liberation and cleansing. Right? So there's the appropriate and the inappropriate, needless, unrequired segment of Russian society that needs to be purified, he says. That doesn't mean getting rid of people, that might mean ideologically brainwashing them. Then he goes on to compare Prigozhin to Hemingway, which is typical of Mr. Dugin, and then he says it's obvious that for the Kiev N regime, which doesn't have symbols like Mr. Prigozhin, that they're really going to truly fear and hate the Wagner group, as does the West, making Mr. Prigozhin's Wagner group, and Mr. Prigozhin personally, their main priority in this conflict. Inside Russia, Dugin goes on to say, people accept Prigozhin unconditionally. Prigozhin has zero support in Russia, literally zero, not even 1%. Because, as we'll discover shortly, the ideological nutcases, the true Z extremists, line up behind figures who have a kind of a real missionary imperialist naivety to them, and who are a bit ideologically for real, as Mr. Prigozhin is not. So they are not in any way attached to Mr. Prigozhin, and that's because his commitments aren't taken to be sincere enough. And Mr. Dugin is, however, trying to blow this up from zero, literally from zero. Whatever he says resonates right there in the heart of the people in society, among the broad Russian Eurasian masses. And so Dugin goes on to say, an ethnic Jew, an oligarch, and a person with a rather turbulent past has before our eyes turned into an archetype of a purely Russian hero, into a symbol of justice and honor for all Russians. And now this is where Mr. Dugin's personal safety becomes increasingly endangered, because he then elaborates this against Russian elites. Prigozhin is most hated by that part of the Russian elite that does not accept this war as fate and does not realize its true and fundamental motive. The very word justice for this part of the Russian elite is unbearable and burns with hellish flames. Prigozhin himself is from this elite, but he's found the courage to renounce the class of the rich, exploiters, cynics, cosmopolitans, who despise all who are less successful, and went over to the side of the warring people, saving his country. In such a situation, these elites wonder how can Prigozhin afford to behave with such a degree of determination, audacity, and independence? Isn't he an experiment of much more influential, and indeed simply the highest, Mr. Putin, forces in Russian politics, which, using his example, are testing the readiness of society to introduce tougher rules and a more consistent, patriotic, people-oriented policy? That's actually a good question. Mr. Dugin goes on. External observers, with all their desire, cannot reliably determine what kind of relationship Yevgeny Prigozhin has with the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Now, let me sort of break this a bit. There is a relationship there, and we don't know exactly what shape it takes. But the point is, Prigozhin only exists because he has some kind of access to Putin that allows him to bypass other layers and levels of the regime. And that is why there is something so fake about all of Mr. Prigozhin's clowning, even though it is indeed strategic and Mr. Prigozhin is indeed thinking of a post-Putin future and positioning himself for that. But the point is, at the moment, the only solid ground Prigozhin has underneath him is his capacity to bypass everybody else and go directly to Putin. So there is that kind of a sanction in place where Mr. Prigozhin has a lot of enemies and a lot of people who dislike him, but there's real slowness about trying to squash him, because he in some indirect way represents, if not the voice, then a kind of a blessing of the thing that sits in the Kremlin, Mr. Putin. So some are convinced that Mr. Prigozhin is sanctioned from above, and some are convinced that he is just engaged in an amateur performance. And of course, both are true. Dugin goes on, for the Russian government as a whole, uncertainty, and this is actually where Dugin is almost giving us a sort of 80% very illuminating analysis, because this is not a dumb guy. For the Russian government as a whole, uncertainty is a natural environment. No one can fully understand where we're dealing with the personal will of the president and where with the initiative of his associates, who are trying to grasp in advance and anticipate the intention of the commander. This is a rather pragmatic approach. In this case, the president is above any collisions within the elites, and the transformation of the system has a kind of freedom to it. If you wish, you can assume that all patriotic and even the most avant-garde initiatives, such as Wagner, are carried out with tacit consent. But no one knows about this for sure. Only guesswork can tell us. And Mr. Prigozhin cultivates this uncertainty to the maximum extent with maximum effect. I think this is actually 80% a reasonable analysis of the Prigozhin phenomena. Now back to Putin's Dugin's mock ideology. Love and trust in Prigozhin and Wagner are growing, and so is anxiety about them in the elites. If the West, Dugin says, is our enemy, then a supporter of the West is a traitor and a direct enemy of the state. If you are not at war with the West, then you are on its side. This is the simple logic voiced by Prigozhin. And in his decisive battle with the external enemy, the masses of the people saw a second future act, the transfer of similar methods to the internal enemy. So this is again a kind of cry for a division of Russian society into those more and less pure. And more strata of society are coming to the conclusion that it is precisely internal enemies that are responsible for the slippage and some failures on the fronts. And then he says further down, and we're condemning what Mr. Dugin is saying here, we demand purification. Next he goes on, having attacked the elites a bit, he goes on to attack the army. Wagner most clearly illustrates what meritocracy is, and that is the power of the most distinguished and most courageous and the most deserving. Our armed forces, quoting Dugin here word by word, clearly need to be rebuilt in a Wagnerian way. In the conditions of war, the old criterion of loyalty and courtier skills, corruption, is no longer enough. Back he goes again to talk about society and the elites. At the same time, all of this applies not just to war, but also to politics, economy, management, administration, education, and culture. There, we need to see and are seeing Prigozhinite trends. So we can also talk about, he says, Wagner principles in all areas. Those who most effectively cope with the set task, even if it's impossible, must come to the fore. Those who can't cope with the set task become secondary. So what we need is elite rotation. In Russia, it's extremely sluggish, but war requires a rotation of elites. And that is a real horror for the elites of the old and incapacitated, and that is a real horror for those elites that are old and incapacitated and sort of cut off from their Western matrix, and without it they're suddenly panicking and freaking out. So I mean, this is stuff that could certainly send Mr. Dugin into a scenario of jail or disappearance eventually, because it's very hard to judge it. So let's first of all say that here Dugin is trying to guess where things are going. He is trying to observe the totalitarian turns happening in society and mostly trying to guess where they're going to go and be there already. And then say, it was my guidance that got us there. So that's a very classic device that Prigozhin has used. The second function he is serving here, this is the second point to make about all of this, is that he is indeed testing the waters in a way that's not entirely useless for the regime. The trouble is, this is a guy who is not just a grifter. We'll discuss that in a second. He's also got some sincere commitments, even if they're sort of quite abstract and mock metaphysical. And therefore he's going to be enormously inclined to overestimate his capacity to endure this course where he is, running ahead of things, testing the waters. That he, can he endure this course without being seen as a kind of parasite eventually by the regime? So that's his danger, and he has risk of hubris in relation to it. And that makes him very different to somebody like Mr. Zhirinovsky, who used to always test the waters in the same way for the regime. Because Mr. Zhirinovsky was essentially a regime employee, whereas Mr. Dugin is really doing this from a kind of distance. He's trying to crash a party that nobody's invited him to. And then the really important point, right, about the fact that this love letter to Prigozhin is an extraordinary way of taking a side against Mr. Girkin and with Mr. Prigozhin. And so there's a couple of key differences here that are worth paying attention to. Mr. Prigozhin is much more Kremlin-controlled than Mr. Girkin. You can say that they're both under some kind of control. There's a kind of a leash on both of them, but it's a much more direct leash that's on Prigozhin and on Girkin. So here Dugin is siding with the more Kremlin-controlled phenomena. The second difference between Girkin and Prigozhin is that Girkin has a genuine movement behind him. It's not a political movement in the sense that it's not got much grasp on institutions in Russia, but it's there. I mean, Girkin can potentially appeal to, with his sort of almost quaint imperialistic fantasies that are appalling in practice, but have a kind of sort of absurd, sort of pseudo neo quality to them. They are so kitsch and derivative, and as I say, would be quaint if they were confined to some kind of a smoky cafeteria. But they're much more real, much more sincerely held than Prigozhin's ideological positions, and they're organic. So Girkin has a following, and he has a kind of a circle of a series of circles of ideological influence. So it would be a stretch, but not a complete stretch, to say that potentially somehow he could be favorably viewed by most of the most activated Z radicals, and whatever is their level of support in the population. Let's put it at 10-20%. So to that 10-20%, Girkin has real access, and he has a meaningful bond with them. So this is an organic social phenomena, whereas Mr. Prigozhin is fake, that he doesn't have any support. So that's a key difference. And it's ironic that the ideologue Mr. Dugin is picking on a fake figure when there's a real figure to pick on. And I suppose the fourth thing to notice about this is that there is a phenomena that is distinctively Western, and that is to grift in an entrepreneurial way through the waves and wash of public sentiment, audiences, algorithms, and try to, in a consumerist way, ride this for various kinds of beneficial outcomes. They don't have to be financial. Now, there are some people in the West who are doing this very consciously, but a lot of people are essentially ending up in that position in a way that they wouldn't themselves recognize. In other words, it's little by little audience capture drift, algorithm drift, financial incentive drift. And often people end up in that situation of essentially being a kind of grifter, but the grift is now subconscious. And then there are the kind of the purer cases whereby even if they're lying to themselves, it is so transparent and absurd from the very beginning that you can't believe that they don't, in some deep way, realize that that's what they're doing. So there's let's pick a relatively sort of benign figure. There's a guy in the United States called Dave Rubin. Right? Dave Rubin is a very perfect example, a very clean example of somebody who has a consumerist relationship with the way they just surf. They surf the waves of public sentiment. And so we've got here Mr. Dugin, this arch anti-Western figure, using largely Western ideas, or using ideas that are at least completely normatively dependent on the West. They are ideas that are sort of just Western ideas in reverse, right? And is using them in a distinctively Western way by expressing a kind of consumerist, entrepreneurial relationship with how a country must talk to itself. It's just that he is doing that entrepreneurial thing in defense of a collapsing empire that is in the middle of a kind of a feverish outburst with vast sort of drift in totalitarian and sort of fascizing directions. And that's, of course, an extraordinary irony because, you know, to be somebody who is an arch expression of the very thing that he hates most about the West, right? This kind of shallow consumerist entrepreneurial stuff. That is profoundly embarrassing for Mr. Dugin. This is my ramble for the day, and of course, thank you so much for surviving it. I hope it was illuminating to some degree. This business of grift we'll talk about. This business of not just grift but drift, you know, in subconscious response to algorithms and audiences. We'll talk about much more. Lots of love.